You were taught that electrons spin, tiny charged balls twirling around like microscopic planets or tops, generating magnetism because spinning charges make magnetic fields. It sounds neat, mechanical, comforting. You could almost picture it. That picture is wrong, not a little wrong, not metaphorically wrong, wrong in a way that makes the picture itself the problem. Electrons do not spin, and the reason that statement feels impossible is exactly why it matters. The first clue that something is off comes from speed. If an electron were a tiny sphere physically spinning fast enough to produce the magnetic effects we observe, parts of its surface would be moving faster than light. Not slightly faster. Ridiculously faster. Physics does not tolerate that, so the spinning ball picture collapses immediately if you take it seriously, which most explanations quietly avoid doing. They keep the picture vague enough that you don't push it to its limits. Feynman hated that. He knew that a picture that only works if you don't think too hard is worse than no picture at all. So what is spin, really? The honest answer is uncomfortable. Spin is not motion. It is not rotation. It is not something happening in space. Spin is a property of how electrons behave when you measure them. That's it. Spin is not something the electron does. It is something the electron is allowed to do. The word spin survives because it came from early attempts to shoehorn quantum behavior into classical language. Those attempts failed, but the word stuck. And it keeps lying to you. Electrons have angular momentum, but not because anything is rotating. Angular momentum in quantum mechanics is not a measure of spinning stuff. It is a measure of how states transform under rotation. That sentence matters more than it sounds like it should. Spin does not describe motion through space. It describes symmetry. If you rotate the entire experimental setup, the electron's state changes in a precise, predictable way. That transformation behaves mathematically like angular momentum, so we call it spin. Nothing is spinning. This is why electrons have spin even when they are not moving, even when they are at rest, even when they are described by stationary states. You cannot explain that with rotation. You can explain it perfectly with symmetry. Now, consider the most unsettling part. An electron has spin 1/2. That number looks innocent until you realize what it means. If you rotate an electron 360 degrees, it does not return to the same state. You have to rotate it 720 degrees. No classical object behaves like that. No spinning thing does that. There is nothing in your everyday experience that comes back to itself only after 2 full turns. Trying to imagine it physically will hurt your brain and still get you nowhere. Because it is not physical rotation. Spin is not something happening to the electron in space. It is something happening to the description of the electron under rotation. This is why every attempt to picture spin fails. You are trying to imagine a geometry that does not exist in ordinary space. Electrons live in a mathematical structure richer than three-dimensional space. Their properties are not confined to the geometry your senses evolved to handle. That is not poetic, it is literal. Spin lives in an abstract space where rotation behaves differently. When you rotate the coordinate system, the electron's wave function transforms according to rules that have nothing to do with little balls spinning. This is why magnetic moments appear. This is why spin couples to magnetic fields. This is why the Stern-Gerlach experiment works, not because something is spinning. Because the rules say the electron responds to rotations in fields in that particular way. The magnet does not grab a spinning object. It interacts with a state that carries spin. Again, the word is the trap. Spin is not the cause of magnetism. Spin is the name we give to a pattern of interaction that behaves like angular momentum. This is also why spin is quantized. You don't get arbitrary values. You don't get to spin a little faster or slower. The allowed behaviors come in discrete packages. That is not how rotation works. That is how rules work. Once you see this, the idea of electrons spinning starts to feel childish. Not because it was stupid, but because it was a placeholder that never got retired. Physics outgrew the metaphor. The metaphor didn't leave. Feynman was blunt about this. He said, effectively, don't try to picture it. There is no picture. There is only a mathematical description that predicts outcomes perfectly. And that description says the electron has an intrinsic property called spin, which behaves like angular momentum under rotations, without corresponding to any rotation in space. If that feels unsatisfying, good. That discomfort is a sound of intuition being corrected. The real shock is not that electrons don't spin. The shock is that you were ever allowed to believe they did. If spin is not something the electron is physically doing, then it cannot be explained by mechanics. There is no axle, no surface, no rotation rate, nothing you could slow down, speed up, or stop. And yet spin behaves with astonishing consistency. Put an electron in a magnetic field, and its spin responds. Measure it along one direction, and you get a definite result. Rotate your apparatus, and the statistics change in a perfectly predictable way. Something real is happening, just not the thing you imagined. Spin is an intrinsic label attached to the electron's state. It tells you how that state transforms when you rotate the experiment. That's all it tells you. There is no deeper mechanical story hiding underneath. This is where intuition usually tries one last escape. People say, fine, maybe it's not literally spinning, but surely it's like spinning. Surely there's some hidden motion we just can't see. No, there isn't. If there were, it would show up somewhere. In radiation, in energy loss, in internal structure, in size, in deformation. None of that appears. Electrons behave in every experiment we can perform as point-like. No measurable size, no internal parts, no structure that could rotate. Trying to imagine hidden spinning parts is not cautious skepticism. It's denial. Spin is not hiding behind the scenes. Spin is the scene. Now look at why this matters. Spin determines how electrons arrange themselves in atoms. It explains why electrons fill orbitals the way they do, why chemistry exists, why matter has structure at all. The Pauli exclusion principle, one of the deepest facts in nature, is a consequence of spin. No two electrons with the same spin state can occupy the same quantum state. This has nothing to do with spinning objects bumping into each other. It has everything to do with how quantum states behave under exchange and rotation. Matter is solid because of spin, not because electrons are spinning. That distinction is crucial. The rigidity of matter, the stability of atoms, the periodic table, the very fact that your body doesn't collapse through itself, all trace back to this abstract property that refuses to be pictured. Spin is not a detail. It is foundational, and yet it is not something happening in space. This is where the shock deepens. Spin lives in a mathematical space that has no direct analog in everyday geometry. When you rotate an electron, you are not rotating a thing. You are rotating a description. And that description changes in ways that defy classical logic. Rotate once, and the state changes sign. Rotate twice, and it comes back. There is no object you can hold that behaves this way. There is no gear, or top, or wheel that needs 2 full turns to reset. This behavior comes from the structure of the equations themselves. Spin is baked into the algebra. This is why Feynman refused to explain spin in the usual sense. There is nothing to explain beyond the rules. You can derive its consequences. You can calculate its effects. You can predict experiments down to absurd precision, but you cannot tell a story about little things spinning without lying. The universe does not owe you a picture. Spin is real in the only way physics cares about. It affects outcomes. It constrains possibilities. It determines what can and cannot happen. It is not real in the way your intuition demands. As motion, as rotation, as something happening in space, that demand is the illusion. Now consider the final twist. Spin is called intrinsic angular momentum, but angular momentum itself does not require rotation. That fact alone should have tipped us off long ago. Angular momentum is conserved because of rotational symmetry. Not because things spin, but because the universe does not change when you rotate it. Spin is a direct expression of that symmetry at the deepest level. It is not caused by rotation. It is the mathematical fingerprint of rotational symmetry itself. Once you see that, the word spin starts to feel almost embarrassing. A relic from a time when physics tried to stay friendly to intuition. But the universe was never obligated to be friendly. Electrons do not spin. They obey rules that look like spin when you insist on speaking classical language. And the sooner you stop insisting, the clearer everything becomes. The hardest part to accept is not that electrons don't spin, it's that there is nothing underneath spin waiting to be discovered. No deeper layer where a physical rotation suddenly appears and rescues your intuition. Spin is already the bottom. Physics does not expect to find a smaller spinning thing inside the electron someday. The theory does not predict it. Experiments do not hint at it. And every attempt to force one in breaks something else that works perfectly. That should tell you something. Spin is not a placeholder for ignorance. It is a complete description. This is where people often misunderstand Feynman. They think he was saying, we don't know what spin really is. That's not what he meant. He meant that spin is known exactly, but it is not knowable in the way people expect. You know what spin does. You know how it transforms. You know how it couples to fields. You know how it combines with other spins. There is nothing missing. What's missing is a picture that fits inside everyday intuition, and that is not physics' problem. Spin exists because the universe has rotational symmetry, and quantum states must respect that symmetry in very specific ways. Some states transform like vectors, some like scalars. Electrons transform like spinors. That word matters. Spinors are not vectors. Rotate them once, and they do not come back to themselves. Rotate them twice, and they do. This is not a quirk. It is the defining feature. You cannot remove this behavior without destroying the theory. And the theory works. It predicts the electron's magnetic moment to ridiculous accuracy. It explains atomic spectra. It explains chemical bonding. It explains why matter has volume instead of collapsing. A spinning ball explanation does none of that. So the spinning picture doesn't just fail to be accurate. It actively blocks understanding. It makes you think spin is something electrons do, when in reality, spin is something electrons are allowed to be under the rules of the universe. That difference is everything. Now look at how this changes the way you think about particles in general. Electrons are not tiny machines with moving parts. They are excitations of fields with specific transformation properties. Those properties are not negotiable. They define the particle. An electron without spin would not be an electron. Spin is not an add-on, it is identity. This is why you cannot explain spin by appealing to something more basic. There is nothing more basic in that direction. The field itself is defined by how it transforms under symmetry. Once again, the universe refuses to give you a mechanical story, and that refusal is consistent. You saw it with energy. You saw it with matter. You saw it with light. Now you see it with spin. Every time intuition demands a thing, the universe offers a rule instead. The shock is not that electrons don't spin. The shock is that reality does not consist of tiny machines at all. What exists are patterns that obey constraints. Spin is one of those constraints made visible. Now comes the final clarity. Electrons don't spin, but they also don't hide anything by not spinning. There is no loss of explanation. Nothing is left mysterious. The behavior is fully captured by the mathematics. The mystery was always the insistence that explanation must look like a picture. Feynman knew better. He knew that understanding in physics is not about comfort. It is about knowing what questions to stop asking. Asking what is spinning is the wrong question. Asking how does a state transform is the right one. And once you ask the right question, spin stops being mind-blowing in the chaotic sense. It becomes precise. Electrons don't spin. They obey a rule so fundamental that rotation itself is encoded into their identity. And that, not the metaphor you were taught, is the real insight. At the end of all this, the word spin should feel uncomfortable, not because it is wrong in calculation, but because it is wrong in imagination. Electrons do not spin the way you were taught to picture spinning. There is no surface turning, no axis, no internal motion you could freeze frame if you had a better microscope. The picture never existed. What existed was a rule that behaved like angular momentum when tested. And instead of admitting that this rule lived outside everyday geometry, physics borrowed a familiar word and hoped no one would take it too literally. They did. And that misunderstanding lasted far longer than it should have. Spin is not motion. Spin is not rotation. Spin is not something happening in space. Spin is how an electron's state responds to symmetry. That is not evasive. It is exact. When you rotate the world, the electron responds in a way that cannot be mimicked by any classical object. That response is stable, measurable, and fundamental. It does not depend on size, shape, or internal structure. It depends only on the rules. Once you see that, the obsession with what is really spinning finally dissolves. Nothing is missing. Nothing is hiding. Nothing is waiting to be discovered behind the curtain. The curtain was the picture. This is why Feynman was always careful to say that quantum mechanics does not explain things in the way people expect explanations to work. It does not replace ignorance with a mechanical story. It replaces it with a rule that works every time. And that is enough. Spin explains magnetism without rotating charges. It explains atomic structure without spinning electrons. It explains the stability of matter without hidden machinery. Everything works because the universe respects its own symmetries. This is the real insight. Reality is not built out of tiny spinning parts. It is built out of constraints that do not contradict themselves. Electrons don't spin because spinning was never required. The behavior you attributed to motion was always symmetry wearing a familiar mask. Once you remove the mask, nothing breaks. In fact, everything becomes clearer. So if this feels shocking, good. It means the wrong picture finally let go. Electrons don't spin. They simply obey the deepest rules the universe has for how things are allowed to be.